Hey guys. Hey Josh. How you doing? At the deck of the Starship Enterprise there. Hey John.
Hey guys, how are you?
Good.
Hey, John.
Hey Josh, how are you?
Good. Where's Noah at? Oh my
The
goodness.
moon tonight. Yeah.
Oh, it's beautiful.
outside my office. It's real nice tonight. So.
That's beautiful. Yeah.
And my computer has been dying with my internet here, so I'm gonna just try my iPad tonight, and I think I might sit outside since it's so nice. So
Hey, I hear it's gonna form a happy face today or something like that today. The moon.
I heard that. I think it's in a couple. Well, actually, let me check my phone. I actually put it in my calendar a week or two ago because somebody tagged me.
Oh, it's not today.
Looks like he's frozen in time.
So, John, you're a pastor right now?
Not right now. I'm part of Kairos.
If it's
Down
that
the
way,
leadership team there, so.
I wouldn't be surprised if you couldn't see it like tonight, anyways. So, good luck. Well, the moon's behind us right now, and Venus they're like the opposite part of the sky right now. So, yeah. Tis not now. But on the 16th, it should be cool looking because Venus has been crazy bright.
Yeah, it's been out there.
Yeah.
It's a sign. Bring on the Kraken.
Man, can you imagine navigating the sea by star?
Those ancient mariners, they were something. Ah. Hey, you got party lights going on there, Noah.
Oh, yeah. It's because I hate fluorescent lights. Like, with an overwhelming prejudice. like an irrational hatred, maybe, of fluorescent lights. So I never use them when I can avoid them. So,
Gotcha.
old patio lights from the house it is. Well, it might just be the three of us tonight, which I'm okay with.
What, you got a ham sandwich there, Josh?
No, it's Italian bread with garlic and butter.
Nice.
Yeah. So, John, are you on the West Coast or the East Coast?
I live here in Lancaster.
Oh, man, the first night I thought for some reason I heard you were on the East Coast.
I moved here about a little over 2 years ago from the East Coast.
Oh, okay.
Now Noah's showing us the moon.
Oh, cool. Yeah, I think I could take mine outside too, but I need a little bit of charge first. Hi, Lynn.
Hey, Lynn.
Hi.
John, did you go to seminary?
Yes,
What seminary did you go to?
I went to Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary in Wake Forest, North Carolina.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, I graduated in 1988.
Wow, that's so impressive, man. That's a lot of schooling. I know to get a degree in seminary is usually more than a typical like master's or something like that. Did you get your master's or doctorate?
I got my master's.
Yeah, like I've looked into it in the past and it was like, I think 10, 15, some even had like 20 more credits. It's like, dang, just for a degree.
Yeah, it was a 3-year program.
Yeah.
I forgot how many credits. It doesn't matter. You come out of there knowing 2 things. One, how much you don't know, and how much you have to learn.
Yeah,
And that the story of Jesus must be told.
right on. Yeah.
And I think the cautious learner does, but man, there are some people that come out of seminary guns blazing because they just, you know.
Yeah, they know just enough Greek and Hebrew to be dangerous.
Yeah. They're not NG Wright though.
No.
I'll tell you what, I've heard some very smart people talk in my day. And NT Wright I think he's the smartest person I've ever heard talk. He did a conference Fuller did a conference with him maybe like 6 or 7 years ago, 8 years ago, down in Pasadena at the Congregational Church right off the 210 there. And so me and Greg from Hollywood, we went down to it. And man, after the first session, I was like, you guys want to see a movie after lunch? Like, I don't think I can. I'm like totally full, like tapped out, like a guy. So after he was done talking, which was absolutely brilliant, some graduate student asked him a question that was beyond me to understand what he was asking. And N.T. Wright answered him by quoting from memory in Greek almost an entire chapter of Romans and then another big chunk of 1 Corinthians off the cuff in his response. I was like,
In his Reeboks.
I was like, yeah, let's go see Spider-Man 2 after lunch. I cannot. That's what? He's, and the great thing is, you know, he's like an active person. Like he's in ministry. He works with people. He preaches sermons, and he's a very like kind, humble person.
Yeah, very
and
humble.
writes, you know, he pumps out these works that are, you know, these like 2-3 volume sets on different things that are just mind blowing in their, you know, kind of scope of what they do, what they look at. But then he also writes like the NT for, you know, everyone series, the New Testament for Everyone series.
Right.
It's like, well, this is like very helpful. And yeah, I appreciate people like that. You know, he said that when he was a boy, I think he heard on the radio actually. It could have been a local church, But I think it might have been in the radio.
Cliffhanger. Oh, the guy's just brilliant.
Guys, hello.
Yeah,
Yeah, we lost you at. Where did we lose him?
I don't know.
Cliffhanger. You left us with a cliffhanger.
You were telling a story, and you're like, it's like you set it up, and then it just paused.
Oh, yeah, he heard on the radio when he was a boy, and then you just went freeze.
Yeah.
Freeze frame.
It was like a call for people of intellect to serve God. So he decided to use his gift to serve God. Like, it was a really intentional shift and kind of like a calling, as opposed to him just being smart and being a really good academic. And I think that's like really evident in his kind of work, you know, like the difference in the quality there. And I actually noticed that in seminary in general, that the professors, kind of regardless of whatever subject they would teach, those that were active in ministry and like involved in community.
Freeze frame.
He has a. Have you guys heard his podcast?
Yes. Yeah.
It's very. It's for the common man, I would say. For the most part.
Hey, there's two Noahs. There's a doppelganger.
Doppelganger.
You're on mute.
Yeah, we can't hear it. He's
All right,
trying.
how about that? Is that better?
It might be an echo. No.
How about now?
I think that's better.
Oh my goodness. I was actually emailing my my school today, just asking them like, hey, you guys, I got to get this fixed. My internet's horrible. I can't zoom. I can hear an echo though. Is there still an echo?
Not too much. You got to turn up the volume though.
Okay, my volume's up all the way. Can you hear me okay?
Now we can. Yep.
All right. Shucks. I don't know why I can't. All right, let me see this. I'm going to just close Zoom on my iPad. How about that? Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. Well, I'll try coming back in with video in a little bit. I'll just do audio for now since my situation is not great. I apologize, but, you know, feel free to make funny faces at me while I'm off video, because I can't even see video right now. So this is just like a dial-in call. But hey, if the audio works, I'll take that over having chopped up crappy video. I saw Lynn hop on here before I lost my video. Was anybody? Hi, Lynn.
Hi,
Hi, how are you doing?
I'm good.
Anybody else hop in here? Is it the four of us?
That's it.
Cool. Jamie will probably hop on at some point like she does when our kids stop being psychotic, which usually takes a while. So pray for her. I am. Okay, so yeah, we'll just kind of hop into it. Last week we talked about, we kind of got talking about out of our conversation on Schofield and kind of those heavy influences in American views of the Bible. We got talking about literalism and foundationalism, which kind of led us to the verge of the topic of the flood, because we talked about creation and creationism, literalism. I mean, we didn't get like crazy into the weeds, and we can certainly talk more about those subjects if you guys want to. But we can also, I feel comfortable going, okay, well, we hit some big bases there. Let's kind of keep moving on to the next thing, because what we're dealing with when we look at the creation story, you know, the questions that we have about, well, what's going on there, and what I was kind of trying to uncover and highlight last week in pressing questions of detail that nobody has thought through 100%. You know, nobody could. That's there's too much detail there. So depending on who's asking questions about the detail going on, you can have some real head scratchers where you go, geez, I don't know. I've never thought of that. So the example that we talked about was Adam being the first human made out of the earth. And what that is, and what that literally is. Is that literally dust? Is it earth? Is it mud? Like dust, mud, earth, clay, carbon. They're all very different things, but, you know, in another sense, they're not really that different at all, are they? The point is God made man out of earth things, earthy stuff. But you know, those kind of questions of detail, and then like what we wind up envisioning because of that detail or lack of that detail winds up inhibiting our expectations of God in these, particularly in narratives, you know, and because we're in narrative right now, we're just gonna, you know, we're in the Pentateuch, we're starting this early section that's narrative, that we know is not a, you know, camera recording of creation. We know that Adam didn't write. Adam was illiterate. Well, you know, what would he have written on? Who was making paper, right? He didn't write. We know that for sure. And the Bible doesn't make that claim at all. So kind of the degree to which we take in the detail of the Bible and the degree to which we read which parts literally, it just totally varies from person to person when we actually start asking detailed questions. You know, much like if I asked you to recount Romeo and Juliet, you guys would probably all get the same general like points of it, but you'd tell it differently. It doesn't mean that your interpretation's bad or that the way you worded it is wrong. It's just different. And if I asked you to give me 5 bullet points of Romeo and Juliet, you probably could. And there's a, you know, probably kind of close to a right or wrong answer for that, you know, or 10 if there was like 10. We were in a class and I taught you that. And essentially you kind of have that, that's what's in the Bible, right? It's these bullet points, it's these big boom, 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 boom. We don't have like 19th century British feely-based tomes that go on forever, you know, where there's like 70 pages of the description of some British tea garden, and you just want to shoot yourself because you decide to read Sense and Sensibility when you're 20 because you think you should read classics. It's just I'm not a fan, okay? That's not what Genesis is, right? It's not that. You're getting kind of these big bullet points of human origins, and so right after, you know, or not right after, but shortly after the whole creation story unfolds, we get to the flood, and that's, you know, that's a big one. It's one of the most referenced events in the whole Bible. Actually, it might be the most referenced event in the whole Bible, the flood. Somebody could fact check that. Not being
Are you
on
talking about the Hebrew Bible or including the New Testament?
both. I know Jesus refers to the flood quite a few times and to waters.
You think that that's referenced more than the resurrection?
Yeah. Oh, in the New Testament, it might be.
Interesting.
I don't know. In the Gospels, it probably is. I feel pretty confident that Jesus would have mentioned the flood probably at least as much as he mentioned his own resurrection.
He mentioned it at least 3 times.
Mm-hmm. Oh, good.
At least 3. I know definitely 2 in reference to his second coming.
Yeah. And then the prophets reference the flood, probably almost all of them do. It's referenced in the Psalms, it's just kind of over and over again. It's this event. And then when we look at, global history, there's clearly people are telling stories about a flood that happened, a big, gigantic, big-ass flood that killed everybody, like a huge one. So what does that mean? It means that there certainly was a large flood at some point that covered a huge geographical location. Absolutely. Even geological records agree with that at points. Where that was and for how long and how the extent of the flood, that's a matter of opinion. Because that's an interpretation of what we're reading. Because if we read with a modern, postmodern lens of looking at the Bible as a kind of scientific enlightenment treatise on telling us descriptions of the accuracy of history, we're going to get it all wrong every time because nobody thought like that back then. Like people just didn't have those categories. So when somebody says all, they are using it the way that people would say all when you're with people, right? When you're telling the stories, when you're around a campfire. So when, the Israelites are celebrating and saying, we went in and we slaughtered everyone. We killed everybody. We killed all. Wow, that plane. I think it's like a C-10. It flew so loud it set off a car alarm. Dang. I know they're flying way lower than they're allowed to. I know they are. Well, anyways, what was I saying?
I think you're making the point when, it says that Israel conquered all of the nation.
Oh, yeah.
But then you would see later on in the Bible that nation's mentioned that maybe all of them killed, but it was hyperbolic or how we would talk to friends in nature.
Yes, yeah, exactly. So you said, they killed everybody, and then we go, oh my God, that's horrific, and just, and then you find out later, like, wait, those people are still around. They didn't kill everybody. Wait a minute, what's happening when they say these kinds of things? It depends on the book, right? Of course, because the Pentateuch, at least my opinion is, it's not written under kind of a kingly patronage, right? The way something like Chronicles might have been, where it's an account, but this is sponsored by the government. The Pentateuch's not that. So there's different books in the Bible that have different, it's always different. There's a different time that things are being written. And so this is early on, and it's very clear that it's like, hey, this is the story of our ancestors. And when they say our ancestors, who gets repeated over and over and over again in the Pentateuch, just in Genesis alone, right? Don't even go into the rest of the books. It's not the God of, Adam, Abel, and Noah. It's the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, right? Like that's who the ancestors are. And that's the point that the Bible points to say, hey, here's your historic person. And here's the point that, like, between Jews, Christians, and Muslims, you got almost 3 billion humans that agree on the fact that Abraham was a real person. We know about where he came from. We kind of know where his ancestors, would have been from and where he traveled to. So, like, this is a guy who we can, with a good degree of certainty, say, wow, a huge majority of humanity probably agrees that this person is a real person from this place and time in this region of the world and is the father of this people group. Well, not just this people group, but, these other people groups over here that splinter off, Ishmael and the whole story. And the fact that the Bible records that is pretty, miraculous in and of itself, that it records these kind of wayward stories of its patriarchs, these things that the founders of the nation and of the faith do that should not be emulated, right? Like prostituting your wife a couple times, when you think she's too old to give you a baby, even though God spoke to you, get a concubine. These are not good things. And the Bible's not saying they're good things, right? And that's kind of the point really, really early on. We can see, perfection's not the point here. God's not demanding perfection from anybody. He's demanding faith. And that's what Abraham has. And so kind of the tradition would be, it's of faith that we receive that tradition. Right. And that's even the wordings of Hebrews in the New Testament. It's by faith that these people moved and did these things. Well, it's by faith that, the Hebrews inherit the word of God as, given to them from their ancestors. And at some point that's written down. And we can get into the points of when that's written down. It's not written down when Noah's around, right? That is not happening. So if you believe there's a 100% global flood that wiped out everything, that's even more reason to believe, like, those people were not writing things down. That was a different civilization. And if you think that it's a flood that happened, in massive proportions in kind of the ancient Near Eastern world and flooded a great deal of the earth, but maybe not the whole thing. And maybe it didn't leave all of the land of the whole entire earth submerged for, over 40 days of water, because it would just kind of probably kill everything. There'd be nothing left for the livestock to eat if they got out, and then everything receded and it was just salt water everywhere, that just instantly shriveled any vegetation that would have lived through over a month of being just soaked underwater. So, like, whatever you believe about it, that event, if and that's maybe kind of a scope of things, is pre-written record of human history, from any records we have of any writings. The Hebrew is among the earliest. Sumerian is the earliest that we think of as a kind of written language, not a hieroglyphic. But that's all right around the time of Israel, and it's in the region of Israel around the time of Abraham. So this is the time that writing is really beginning in human history. So, we can talk about different concepts of authorship or when things are written down, but I'm going to say like the earliest things that are written down would have been Abraham-ish, with like maybe very primitive writing, and then post exile, post or post Exodus. So that's my guess for when things are written down. So this is a writing of the story of their ancestors, and we can say it's inspired by God, and that can mean many different things. So I'll just say I believe it's inspired by God. I believe it's the story of their ancestors as they experienced God's movement and wrath and punishment in the past, or as it was told to them. And I believe there's also a ton of symbology going on in it. So what do you guys think about the flood, or what are your kind of biggest questions about it? What are your thoughts?
I think it was probably a global flood. I don't see any reason why it couldn't have been, as the authors indicated.
So when I was like 12 years old, I was bored one day and decided to research every single reference of the Great Flood, like in myths and, like not just the Bible, but like in all cultures. Because in my class that year, I had to read a part of the Epic of Gilgamesh in which it talks about the Great Flood happening, right? So it's a little bit different from the account provided in Genesis, but there are still a lot of similarities. So I was curious as to what other, groups of people had records of that. And when I was in third grade, I had to read an account from the Andes Mountains that talked about a great flood, that one guy, had to bring a bunch of animals up to the top of a mountain and wait until the flood was over. And so that day I read through like a bajillion different accounts from all around the world. And the only areas of the world that didn't really talk much about a flood, or the vague references to it were pretty clearly not talking about a flood, were areas like in Australia. So
right.
pretty much talking about like the Americas, Eurasia, Africa, like there were references all over talking about some kind of flood that happened at some point. The details of each story were pretty, they were different, but usually there was a male protagonist that was chosen by the gods or God, and, was, chosen and had to take care of the situation accordingly. So I think that that's a pretty strong indication that it did in fact occur, even if you're just looking at it from an external skeptical view, like from a non-religious point of view. But specifically how that would occur,
Yeah.
Yeah. But that was pretty much the conclusion that I came up with, just even going outside of the Bible and saying, okay, really, do other cultures reference it? And the answer is yes, definitely they do. And there are some striking similarities in a lot of those stories.
Yeah, absolutely. I can't remember. Did one of you guys share with me it was a Wikipedia page of all the global references?
That was me.
Yeah, John, did you share that with me or with everyone?
I put it on the Facebook page where our thing is advertised. So I don't know
cool.
if everybody read it or not, but as Lynn was saying, it's from all over.
Yeah, everywhere.
All over.
They got them all over the place.
And what's striking to me is that in a lot of these cases, the waters are seen as a form of chaos and judgment.
Yeah.
And that in the end, God brings order out of that chaos. So in a sense, it's a second creation story.
Yeah, it is.
You know, what that all means, I don't know. But, you know, it's not isolated to Mesopotamia.
Right. Right.
And what's fascinating about it, too, you know, you talk about pre-writing. It's handed down oral tradition upon generations, upon generations, upon generations till, you know, whenever that event took place. And these people had no connection with one another. There was no internet. There was no New York Times, London Times. I don't know,
Right.
major newspapers in in the Far East, but there was no AP, no BBC, nothing like that. And it's a consistent event that happened worldwide.
And it's an easier event to repeat orally and transmute over cultures over a long, long period of time to than the creation account of the world, right? That's a little bit more detailed and specific. A flood story kind of mutates, and you see it's a different all over the place, right? The guys are named differently, the god or gods are named different. Sometimes it's you run up a mountain, sometimes you know, build a boat. There's a handful of different, you know, kind of changes and modifications, but you see that all over the place as this kind of, you know, primitive origin story of humans.
And you know what? No, I think that, my opinion, that it's ridiculous that you have some of these people looking for the evidence of quote unquote Noah's Ark on Mount Ararat when it's a global thing from all these different cultures. To me, it's ridiculous, and it doesn't change the story.
No, I agree with that, John. But didn't Marco Polo say he saw the Ark of the Covenant? I mean, sorry, the Ark in the mountains of Ararat.
I don't know. I'm not familiar with that, Josh.
The account of Marco Polo though is not also a super. It's pre-scientific enlightenment as well, so it would be he would think closer probably to the people of Abraham and Moses than he would of Isaac Newton or me and you, right? Because he was, he was pre-scientific enlightenment. So
his other observations were taken into account as historical.
Oh, I think, you know, they're historical accounts, but, you know, it's the same way when you read Herodotus, right? He's a historian, and he's a remarkable person because he kind of travels the world, the known world, right? He says, I've traveled the world. He didn't go literally everywhere, but he says he has. And he gives accounts of things, and, you know, he includes all kinds of fascinating things, facts, you know, their customs, ways of life. But then there's also a lot of, you know, he's an ancient Greek person, so kind of there's mythology mixed into things, and the local mythology is kind of included as the history, and, you know, people just they thought that way back then, in general. So I'm not saying that it's not important, it didn't happen. What I'm hoping that you and everybody can see is that whether it's 5,000 years ago that stuff was written down, or it was maybe 4,000, 3,500 years ago, when, during the time of the Exodus, around then, and things are written down, or whether everything was written, the most liberal scholars, they say everything was written while they were in Babylonian captivity after the exile, right? Like in a way later. What, it doesn't matter. At whatever point that is, those people all thought way differently than we did. Their standards of what is like, what words meant are very different than what ours are. If you ask somebody to be accurate, okay, their version of what accuracy is much, much different than the version of accuracy of you and me that live in a world of like IP addresses, mathematical formulas, things where like precision matters, car parts, right? We deal in a world of like precision and scientific accuracy. Before people wrote, they definitely didn't. They didn't think of the world in those terms. And then even when they did start writing, they didn't conceive of the world in kind of like accurate scientific terms. And they won't for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, right? That's actually like a more relatively newer thing for humans. You know, we've only been doing that a few hundred years. So for us, our job in whatever part of the Bible we're reading, whether it's the New Testament or the Old Testament, is to go back and read something like that as somebody who doesn't think about algebra or math or calculus, that doesn't know how big the world is or what the different people groups of the world are accurately right now, or even what the continents of the earth are, right? Like, the writers didn't know those things. Their scope wasn't that big. They couldn't have. There's no way that Noah could have known what the world was when it flooded, right? Like, no, I mean, nobody could have. That's impossible. It's not until the late 20th century that we get into outer space that we're like, oh, okay, now we kind of see a little bit more holistically the world. We think about that. I grew up with images of NASA and, you know, moon landings, and, you know, all of us did. So that's normal for us. But people of the Bible didn't think that way at all. So to overlay all of our kind of like terms and categories of things and our expectations for those categories being filled. So my expectation, if you say, yeah, this is true and accurate today, and you told me that about, you know, computer parts I ordered from you, I would expect them to be exactly what I ordered, right? Like down to the number and the right, because that's the world we live in. But if I then go say, well, I expect accuracy from the Bible in those kinds of terms and measurements, we're asking something from a book that is not there. Not because it couldn't be there, but because people wouldn't know what the hell to do with it if it was there. Can you imagine if God came down and started talking to people that were like in the Exodus out in the middle of the wilderness? And he's like, look, guys, at the subatomic level, there's these things. They're called neutrinos. And he starts like giving them physics or really like telling them how the universe works and how like stars and everything, how it works at like a level that we understand it today. People wouldn't know. They wouldn't even understand. They'd have no category for that. So when we go back, we it's not that there are not answers and directions for all those categories that we have today. It's just that we have to let a smaller world of the Bible, and I mean that in a way of like histories like that, just in general, ancient history. So the nice thing about if you're like become a student of ancient history is there's only so many documents that you have. When you get in modern history, it's like, well, there's just unlimited documents and unlimited artifacts of every nature. So the world's smaller. There's less people in it, right? 10,000 years ago, the average person would know 100 people in their lifetime. That's about how many new people they'd ever meet in their whole lifetime. 100 people. My kind of case I'm trying to make is to say, when we go back and read a text, just like with the creation narrative, let's not look for the scientific answers right away. We can let those kinds of things emerge as we naturally see things from the text. But I am a fan of being not a defender of truth, but a seeker of truth. Because if we're just constantly seeking truth, we can get obnoxious about it with people, which is like defending the truth, but without becoming kind of, self-championing, kind of self-righteous people about what we think is truth and not truth. So if we're just looking for the truth here, then looking at the, accounts of flood narratives around the world, we can say something is true that's going on here. Now, yeah.
I just I don't see any reason we can't take the words of Genesis for as what they say. I was kind of listening to you, and I see the argument, but I don't see anything supporting it. It's just probably it's because that's not what we're trying to do right now, and I get that. But
yeah.
And I understand that, and I can respect that, but I just don't to me, it's like saying that, it's probably this way. They probably don't know this. Maybe you're right. But
I'm actually saying that we should take the words exactly for what they say. We just have to learn how to read them as ancient people would read them, not as modern, postmodern Americans, because if we do, we'll always miss what is being said, whether that's a parable of Jesus, right? Like, we know that's really important to do with parables, because if we don't, they don't make a lot of sense to us. But when we get out a commentary and go, oh, well, this was like a thing that farmers would have understood here about, sowing seeds, and oh, okay, wow, all right, well, that makes a lot more sense then. Or, oh, this is how people use these words or terminology. Oh, okay, that parable makes a lot more sense then. Even knowing something about Jesus saying that you have to eat his flesh and drink his blood, knowing about Passover and that that's not literal, and that Jesus meant that in a bigger kind of sense, but also meant to offend people literally with it. We know to do that in the New Testament. And that's a more recent document written in a much more modern language than Hebrew. That is much more directly related to English than Hebrew is. All the more so we should do that the further back we go, right? So when we for like a non-biblical example, if we read about somebody in the Civil War writing home to mom and dad and just saying they're homesick and asking them to send them some faggots, we might go, oh my God, what? Like, what's happening here? Is this sex trafficking? Is this gay stuff going on? How derogatory. Unless we realized, oh, that is a derogatory term, and we know that is a derogatory term, but it used to just mean like a log on a flame log or a cigarette. So whether it's euphemisms of language or just the contextual setting, our job is to learn how to read the literal words, what's written on the page, as not ourselves. And then afterwards, we can, of course, read it as ourselves and then ask all of the questions, right? All of the science questions, all of the practical living questions. We're free to ask all of those. But if we don't get the originality behind it, we'll miss it. And the point wasn't. And we can talk about this as long as you guys want to, because I'll stand pretty firm on the fact that the point of the flood story wasn't to tell about that literally every single square acreage of dry earth in the entire world, including the top of the Himalayas, was covered in water for more than 40 days. It rained for 40 days, right? And then it was covered for a longer period of time even after.
But why would you
So
say that?
hold up. I'll just circle the point, and then you're well free to talk about that as much as you want. So that's not the point of Genesis, because nobody would have been asking that question when it was written, or any time for a long time after that, because people didn't think about the world the way you and me think about the world.
Yeah, what you're saying, Noah, what is the truth of the story rather than the actual quote unquote facts of the story?
Yes, yeah. And like facts matter. So I don't want to like downplay that. I know what you're saying. I just want to be clear, for you, Josh, I want to be clear on that, because I agree with what John's saying. It's not about facts, because nobody back then thought about facts the way you and I think about facts, whether they were Hebrews or Philistines or, people living in ancient China. Just nobody anywhere, humans, didn't think about things the way we think about things. And this is a challenge, not just for us approaching the Bible, but for approaching anything historically. It's hard for us to do. And it's why it's easy to judge people in history, because it's hard to enter back into their world and see, just what it would have been like. So I believe that the point of the flood story is not to give you or me detailed factual knowledge about the science behind a literal global flood for this extended period of time. Okay, so now I said my point. Yeah, go for it. Ask a question or poke away at that.
Yeah, I just I don't remember what I was saying, but I think you said something like you could stand pretty firm and talk all day about how the main point of Genesis flood wasn't that all people were wicked that died of a flood. And so I was gonna say, well, what, because when you even this, like the statements you're saying, I kind of get that you're looking at it through a historical progression of mankind's going and saying that way. Everybody's looking at through today's lens and stuff, but to actually look at ancient literature and compare it to what it's saying, it's not. I don't think it's unfounded to come away with some similar conclusions that a modern reader would come with today.
Yeah, I agree with you, and facts do matter, and I think what we can conclude from looking at the Bible and all these other texts and some of even our modern science, is that there was a big flood and everybody remembered it, and the point was God was kind of starting humanity over again, right? Like, so to me, that's the point of the flood story. God hit reset on humans, and it was it's interesting too, because I think that when you take just the literal words in Scripture and what they mean at face value and let them speak for themselves, I see the Bible over and over and over again, reaffirming what we discover through new steps in modern science. So in Scripture, water is chaos, right? It says it right at the beginning. It's like, oh my gosh, it's chaos everywhere. God has to save the world from the watery chaos. And so out of the water, God separates it and life emerges. And so whether you're a biologist or an anthropologist or a creationist, everybody believes that life begins with the primordial waters. Everybody does. It doesn't matter what side of a fence you might fall on something like that. And then, there's creation, and there's ancient people, primitive people, and then at some point there's a big flood, and that is no more. But God recreates humanity with kind of like a new intentionality and purpose. And I'll tell you what, man, I'm a sucker for any and all of the kind of conspiracy theory stuff on like a much older dating for pyramids and all of that, like because we like to talk with more certainty than we have about everything in academic worlds, including our like historical timelines. They're way messier than we like to admit that they are. And so, you know, if you go way back, I'm like, yeah, I think that there's reason to believe that humans could have been even, you know, more highly advanced than we thought they were. And God did wipe out a good deal of this like emerging civilization that was on a path for quicker destruction than we've been on, even though we're on a pretty quick path for destruction. So, but I also don't believe that the point of the generations in Genesis is to give, you know, date by date, you know, 365-year accounts of the history of the world. Because again, people didn't think like that, and they didn't have a dating system for that. Everybody's dating systems were like, well, from this war, or from when this person became king, or from this guy. Now, with the Hebrews, it's from Adam, right? But it's just told in generations. And you're told how long people live. And so if you take that literally, it's like, well, people lived a really, really, really long time before the flood. I'm not saying that's not possible. Or those people didn't live quite that long, but those are like, you know, symbolic ages. Maybe the way before the flood, there could have been humans for a lot longer than what we see in, you know, in Genesis with this kind of like generational account, that humanity could have been on a much higher path along the way for civilization and much more advanced for hundreds and hundreds and thousands of years. So, you know, I just look at those things. I say, okay, well, nobody is asking for these kinds of dates that we're asking for. So if they're not asking for that, what are they saying here? What's going on? Well, there were humans, and then they got wicked, like really bad, really, really bad. And that's the case in most of the narratives, most of the flood narratives. And God's anger or justice, or sometimes in some of the stories, it's his pettiness, comes in this flood, right? So the point would be, look, obey God, don't turn to wickedness, and he won't kill everybody. Which sounds horrible and harsh and ridiculous to modern thinkers, right? That sounds so primitive, but people were primitive. They need stories like that. Why did we used to tell fairy tales or, you know, like Little Red Riding Hood and stories like that, right? It's so that kids don't go out in the woods and don't get eaten by wolves. Like, because that's the reality that people lived with. You and I are not afraid of getting eaten by wolves today. That's not like our reality. That's something I'm concerned about. I'm also not particularly concerned about floods. I mean, we live in the desert, so I think we're really safe on that one. But even unless you live in like New Orleans or Amsterdam or something like that, or right along like the Mississippi, you're not particularly worried about floods these days. But that was like perhaps the biggest natural disaster people were concerned about for a really long time, because everybody lived near, well, the seaside or, you know, rivers, which flood. I mean, rivers, they flood from time to time, and sometimes they kill a lot of people when they flood. So floods were like regular things. It's not like there was one flood in human history. Floods happen all the time. They've happened in the 21st century. So if we just set aside all of the questions about literalism, then what do we take away from a literal reading of the Bible? So it's not that we are saying that things didn't literally happen, or that we shouldn't read the Bible and the things on the page straight up. I'm saying we shouldn't read them we should read them straight up, and we can't do that until we can differentiate what is a modern American way of reading something and what's an ancient way of reading something. And when we can do it both ways, then we're getting closer to a good interpretation.
I don't disagree with all that. I really don't. But I want to go back again to the Israelites and the calendar. Not that I think like with the genealogies and stuff like that, I really don't know. But in Exodus 12:40, it says, now the length of time the Israelite people lived in Egypt was 430 years. At the end of the 430 years, to the very day, all the Lord's divisions left Egypt. So the author of Exodus indicated that it was 430 years to the very day, indicating that there was some kind of record keeping. At least that's how.
Yeah, that's a really great verse. I'm so glad you found that. And why would that length of time be so important to say we record it to the day? That particular length of time that they're noting. I mean, what are they noting? What are they saying? Like, hey, this is the 430 years to the day.
I think the day itself that they are liberated matters to the Jewish people. And I know Abraham was told to, when he was making a deal with God, he fell asleep. And he was told they would be slaves. So I don't remember the story well enough to say if it was 430 years exactly.
Well, I just mean like they're pointing out 430 years because, okay, so when life's really good, right, you're just kind of cruising along, and things are usually more or less the same. It's easier to lose track of time. When things are really, really bad, you like mark the days, right? Like, what do people do in solitary confinement or in the Holocaust camps, right? They're like literally like tracking.
Or in COVID-19.
What's that?
Or in COVID-19 quarantine.
Right. Like whenever this thing lifts, it'll be like, oh, it was 480 days or whatever, we're under quarantine, because they're in slavery and oppression. So for them, it's like, hey, marking these days was important, and they didn't lose because here's the thing, right? In slavery, one of the tools of the oppressor is to let the slave be absorbed into the culture. So to strip away your own identity to the point where you're no longer a slave that was taken somewhere or captured or enslaved by somebody, or your parents weren't, or whatever. You're just people that have lived on that land, and those are the people that are in charge forever, right? They've lost their own sense of history. So during the time of enslavement is when the cultural identity of the Israelite people is tested, and that's when that's when the story of their own history, it becomes even more important, because they're telling it as a counter narrative to the Israelites' story that they're enslaved, that the gods want it that way, that it's always been that way since the beginning.
Yeah, we don't want to confuse that they were in slavery for 430 years, because when they first arrived to Egypt, they weren't slaves. They were just
right.
So we don't know how much of that time for sure they were in slavery.
Yeah, but none of it's a good time though, right? Because they're not in the land that they were promised, and they were driven there by famine. And out of serious family dysfunction where they tried to kill their youngest brother. So Egypt in general is just not good, and never in scripture is it referred to in a positive way. So it's like, hey, that was the time that we were in, that was the bad time.
Yeah, I guess the point I was going with is that they did have the capability and seemingly in the means to be able to keep some kind of record of calendar or time in there.
Yeah,
But I
and
don't want to, I actually don't want to discard what you're saying about maybe things get rounded, things are just generally stated sometimes, and I think that could be true, but I'm just like, wait, these guys weren't like arrogant and I'm sorry, ignorant and just had no capability of doing all that,
Yeah, no, and like so ignorance, and is very important to note that, because we can think that way. Like if somebody doesn't know something, we think that, oh, it's embarrassing, they're ignorant, which is true today. If somebody doesn't know something that they should or could easily be common knowledge because we've got the internet, it's like, well, you should know, you shouldn't use the word faggot unless you're referring to like a log from the 19th century, right, in literature or something. That's kind of commonplace, and if you don't know that, you're ignorant, and that's true. Now, if we go backwards and look at people and apply that same standard that we have, yeah, those people are ignorant, but of our knowledge, right? They're not ignorant of the knowledge base of their time. So I'm saying that the kind of hub of the Pentateuch, the origins of the Hebrew people, are in Abraham, and him as a historical person is very important. It's more important than Adam being a historical person, in the same sense of not saying that God didn't create Adam or create man, but saying that for the Israelite people, Abraham being a real person is super important. And so when they go to Egypt, this is the time that Hebrew is they're going to develop it as a language, based off of other Semitic languages and based off of being in Egypt for a really long time. And they learn mathematics and counting from the Egyptians. They learn all kinds of stuff while they're in slavery, which shouldn't be surprising to us. They're enslaved by the world superpower of the time. So all of the best, technology and counting systems and on and on and on is in Egypt at the time. And when their leader in Exodus becomes an Egyptian prince who's educated, right? Like that's a unique thing. That's a cool thing. And we look at that and go, no, they should just know how to count, or they should know how to do. Well, no, that's not really how the world works. And I also think we should probably take from that, if we think about that and look at that like, oh, God uses the time in slavery, the times of slavery, just as much as he uses the times of Exodus in the desert, just as much as he uses the times in the pasture. And so, like on an interpretive level, I think that's kind of beautiful to see that, even while they're being enslaved, the Egyptians are, they're benefiting the Hebrew people. And because the Hebrew people are resilient and they cling to their history and they cling to their roots and their identity in the God of their ancestors, right? The God of Abraham. They don't just kind of assimilate into kind of Egyptian background poor people in slavery. They eventually become so obnoxious, and God, intervenes, and they escape slavery, which, that doesn't happen a lot for people ever in history. It's very rare, right? The Emancipation Proclamation, the Civil War, that's a unique moment in history. The fact that the Hebrew people escaped slavery, well, we're going on a good few times now globally, historically, is remarkable. And in some ways, it's like, man, with each enslavement, they become more resilient. And, that's kind of their thing. They're known for that. That's part of their national identity now and today. So, yeah, it's not. I'm not saying don't take anything literal. I'm saying take it literal. Don't overlay what you assume is literal on top of it, right? Like, so when we say now and then, but also ask the questions, because in this case, right, like you're saying, Josh, they have the ability to count. Yeah, they do. They're learning calendaring and counting and record keeping. All of this is happening in Egypt while they're there, and it's also a bad time where they're counting and they're reckoning the days. And I believe that God's not like silent when it's not written down. He was speaking to people. There were prophets among the Hebrew people while they were enslaved. Otherwise they wouldn't be a people, right? Like, people don't do that just out of tradition's sake. That's too hard. So I think God's in there working, and they're learning calendaring and counting after the time of Abraham. Before Abraham, right? Before 2000 BC, BCE, whatever you want to go with. People aren't writing. And so that kind of accuracy of day counting would be really hard without writing. And kind of just unnecessary. Like, it wasn't something that people had to do. They didn't really think about doing that. So, yeah, what thoughts on that?
This moment of silence is brought to you by...
Well, let's go backwards then and talk about the flood a little bit more. Seeing this as kind of like, and it really is, if you're looking at that, that's kind of the like big epic between creation and Abraham is the flood. You could say the flood in Babel, right? But the flood's greater. It's bigger than that. So what is that? Just in terms of like, people are receiving this story from their forefathers. This is Yahweh's story that he's saying, hey, this is the way that, I rescued humanity. What does that mean? And what should we think about that? Like, I don't have anything in front of me, and I'm not really I don't spend tons of time on this kind of stuff. Sometimes I do. It's like a pet interest. I don't find a lot of fruit in it, so I don't find much reason to spend a lot of time researching this kind of stuff. But I enjoy watching YouTube videos and whatnot on it. So you guys might know more than me in terms of like the specifics and the science.
Well, what's interesting to me, Noah, with the end of the flood story, they get to the land, it dries up, and then you have the story of Noah's 3 sons.
Yeah.
And then it goes into chapter 10 in the Tower of Babel. And then we're introduced to Abraham in chapter 12. They were just as messed up in chapter 9 and chapter 10 as they were before the flood.
Yeah.
What's going up. So humanity is, what's the word I'm looking for, is one big magnificent mess.
Yeah.
And it's God's grace that I think the ancient Hebrews were clinging on to in the midst of slavery, that he was going to deliver them one way or the other. It was the faith of Abraham that they held on to. Some of them made it their own, others didn't.
Yeah.
And then here's Moses, who is raised a prince, very well could have become Pharaoh and could have liberated the Hebrew people as Pharaoh. But he was a hothead and he murdered somebody.
Yeah.
And then he goes off into the wilderness for 40 years to return again as an 80-year-old prophet, sage, leader. Just an interesting how the story goes and God's interaction with humanity, specifically the line of Abraham, and made them a nation.
Yeah.
People as many as the sand of the grains of sand of the sea and the stars in the sky.
Yeah.
And the truth, what is the truth of that second creation story is that God wants a people to reflect his image, to mirror him and who he is in character. Up until the flood, they messed up big time. As if we still don't have that, we're still on that course. Some things never change.
Yeah, that's true. That is true.
So I don't know, getting back to the flood story, the truth of the matter is that there was a flood. A lot of people were wiped out. Some people remained, and this new creation was started, I think to reflect again what the true nature and character of God is, to really, image him and mirror him to the outside world. And even though Abraham was called, he didn't mirror him very well.
Yeah.
It wasn't until Jesus, who was the God man as opposed to the earth man in Adam. I had forgotten that earth and Adam were interconnected in that word play, that play on words. And, the earth man is not to reflect the things of earth, but to reflect the things of God. And, we have that perfectly in Jesus.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that kind of like...
So anyway,
I was just saying, I think that series of revelation is... that's the kind of thing that's important to remember for theological humility, because again, right, it's easy to look back at Abraham and be like, oh, what a loser, he pimped out his wife and he cheated on him with a concubine and on, but he lived in a barbaric world, right? Like, it was way different than the society that you and I live in. Even the way people viewed marriage and whatnot, it doesn't justify anything. It just helps us to remember that didn't take place in suburbia, right? That didn't happen yesterday. Well, whatever narrative we're reading, whatever.
Right. Wasn't the Santa Clarita Diet.
Well, okay, Josh, maybe you could fill in for me a little bit then on like a literal kind of young Earth creationist level. What's the dating for the flood? What did they say, 6,000 years ago?
I think so. I think most conservatives say 6,000 to 10,000.
And do you know what the I don't know. Like I said, I don't know what any of the answers are for this stuff, but what would the best response be that you have heard to things about ice ages and those types of things?
Yeah, I've heard a lot of people try to insert time between Genesis, I think it's verses 1 and 2 or verses 2 and 3, to try to keep the timeline of the genealogies and adding up the ages together. That's one way people will try to do that. As far as the fossil record's a great a great example of different, like a clear record of different types of animals. People will say, well, and when, in early parts of Genesis, it says that God even created different types of creatures and sea creatures and stuff like that. So, like, I don't have an answer to all this myself. I don't know, really haven't looked into it much myself.
Yeah, no, I was just curious because, I mean, usually there's an answer for every question. It doesn't necessarily mean it's right? But there's always, somebody's got an answer for everything.
Sure.
Whether it's like the dinosaurs, and I've heard all kinds of different things like, oh no, Noah fit the dinosaurs on the ark. It's like, oh, come on. That's maybe a little bit too far right there. Yeah, like you were saying, like time between Genesis 1 and 2, or of course, a popular option with Genesis is that the 7 days of creation are 7 ages or 7 eons, or interpretive that way, which, I mean, I think that for a whole bunch of reasons, none of them being trying to prove or disprove one thing or the other, just out of like internal logic from the Bible itself. I go, yeah, that doesn't seem to be the point. So if the sun is created after the first day, how is there a first day? And how was that 24 hours? And if there was no sun, who cares? Like, just like, well, what's the point then? Like, and I've had this conversation with people, and they're like, well, God knows it was tracking. And I'm, again, just why? What does he get out of that? What is that? That doesn't seem even logical. Like, I feel like I'm doing a lot of work at that point to try to make that understanding of what days of creation means. Which, again, and I know this from, studying history long enough now, but I also know this from studying and teaching history long enough now to know we don't know or think about the fact that people really genuinely thought differently than us at different times in history, right? Like, the people 200 years ago thought way differently than us, than the people 1,000 years ago, and way differently than 2,000 years ago, and then even further back. So, yeah, that's actually kind of a pet project interest of mine, trying to teach history to students, is kind of the pedagogy that helps us break that fourth wall dimension of kind of viewing everything as static or in one box. It's either all in the past and its history, and none of it's really like it is today, right? Like, it's hard to think of somebody like Noah or Abraham as just a regular person, actually, right? Like, for anybody, I mean, it's hard to think of a historical figure that way. It's hard to think of George Washington that way. So breaking that wall and being able to think past that and think through kind of the reality and the context and the flesh that would go on an event, I find fruit in that for its own sake, not specifically for the Bible. But boy, I feel like it translates really well, because again, if I'm reading Genesis and can go back to thinking about life as a pre-modern person, which I've got a better grasp on than I used to have, but I'm not like a pre-modern historian by any means, so I've got a little bit of an understanding on that, but I actually don't know if anybody does. I don't know if being an expert in studying ancient history makes you more able to even be able to think like those people. It's more a mental exercise of working backwards and going, well, how would have people thought before, X, Y, or Z was available, right? So before writing was available, geez, people really would have been thinking differently. Just think about how different you and I all think about our brains are wired since the internet, right? Like we think differently. Like we think about life differently. We think about information differently. We even think about questions differently and our possibilities because of a huge technological leap. So if we can kind of reverse engineer that and go backwards, then when we hear days of creation, somebody might, an ancient person might be thinking of literally 6 days, but with absolutely no thought beyond that. You know what I mean? Like, there's not like, yeah, well, okay, well, how did that happen? And how are the birds related to the creatures of the sea? And how, like they didn't have the thoughts, the questions that we do. That doesn't mean that they're ignorant. They're just ignorant of the wealth of information that we have as people living with the internet. They just, so they wouldn't have been asking those things. So they may have very well indeed taken it completely literal as a 24-hour day, because again, they don't know that a 24-hour day is because the earth is spinning at the rate that it is while it's revolving on an ellipses around the sun at a tilted axis. They don't know that. People in the New Testament don't know that. They don't know those things. But that's kind of the beauty of the Bible. It speaks to the truth of the matter, kind of regardless of our ignorance of scientific information, relative to the day and age we live in. So that's not to say it's a license to be ignorant about earth knowledge. That's just saying God's grace, our ability to read the Bible and take away what we should from it, is not contingent on how much scientific knowledge we have about the world we live in. Though as we go along and learn more about it, I find it lining up more and more with the Bible. And I think that's the beauty of why the Bible's vague at the beginning with the creation of the world, right? It's specific a little bit with some of these, days or ages, however you want to read that. But it's not really deep. There's not a ton of detail in there. But that's probably for good reason, right? Because when ancient people write down tons of detail, it's real messy. And nowadays we read it and go, yeah, that's not historically accurate. We don't think that the Iliad really happened, right? There's some historical events around that thing that did take place, but that story is not, we're not thinking that.
We don't think Athena came down and fought in the battles alongside.
Right, exactly. So it's a good, to me, it's a good thing that the Bible is exactly what it is. It speaks to a point about creation, about who God is, about all the things that we should take away from that story. And it does it at a level that allows for, however big or small our understanding of the world and the universe is at the time, to scale to that. Right, like knowing that, there's ice ages and there are fossil records, and there aren't really a lot of fossil records of dinosaurs being buried alongside humans. There would be if they were around each other, like for hundreds of years, thousands of years. There's also gigantic bugs that used to live on the earth, and like land sloths that were 9 feet tall that roamed North America. And the Mojave Desert and the Sahara Desert used to be green. Like, we know all those things. But we also know some cool things like the Black Sea that's, it's a salt sea. It used to be a freshwater sea. So at some point it was submersed in, salt water, right? So it's more like, I view it more as like, it's a puzzle at that point to just go, well, how do those things fit together? Instead of taking, you know, like I said, an a priori commitment to this specific version of how things played out. Not that I arrived at on my own conclusions from researching it, but because other people said this is how it has to be. Putting that aside and just taking the Bible, taking kind of the knowledge of the world that we have at the time, not taking the kind of interpretations and the very steeped in jargon, you know, messages about those things, but just taking them and trying to fit puzzle pieces together and go, oh, look, there's world narratives all over the place of a flood. And there are weird things like the Black Sea being turning to salt water that used to be fresh water. But there was also a global ice age, and there was, you know, so it's more like just kind of lining things up and going, hey, where do we see truth lining up between these things, instead of looking at it with the pessimistic view of going, hey, when I hold this up next to this kind of specific version, what do I have to strike down, discredit, you know, run away from, ignore, suppress, etc., which we can do with all kinds of things. So that's a lot of baggage, though, and you're doing a lot of work with the text to do that. So I'm a fan of just taking the text at literal face value, not American face value, but like literally what it means. And if I don't think I've got a good understanding of what it would literally mean to somebody that heard it back when it was written, that's when I know I've got to do a little homework and get a good commentary out, or go watch a video from the Bible Project or something like that. Because, you know, if we read Song of Solomon, it's gibberish. It doesn't make any sense. Who the hell wants to have their necks compared to the flocks of Gibraltar? You know, like that's not really doing it for me. That's not turning me on. That's not, you know, that's not a compliment. It doesn't make any sense to us today at all. And that was written after the Pentateuch was written, right? That's more modern writing than Pentateuch writing. So, yeah, I think the flood is a fun topic because it is so universal. It's a great lens to kind of, well, when we look at that and kind of how we approach that can be kind of pretty, not, it can be determinative, but it can also just be telling of how we read the Bible and read the various books of the Bible, the story of the Bible, what we think of the Bible itself. So I've got a few resources I'll share with you guys that I've found fun about the flood. One is, and this, maybe don't start with this one because it might be too much if you're like trying to wrap your mind around just thinking about the origins of humans differently without having to feel like you have to defend a certain timeline. Just going, well, let's just not look at like what a science book's saying or the Bible. I'm just going to go wander down the Wikipedia page of human fossils, which, you know, on Wikipedia pages, you can reorganize the tables however you want. So you can look at fossils by continent, by different subspecies, because that's the other thing with narratives, and maybe what we can talk about next week would be Neanderthals, right? And we can talk about that with even Nephilim. Maybe we can talk about that in a minute. What do we do with those? Because there are those fossil records, and there's lots of them. It's not like one person. And then the longer we go, the more fossil records we find. And so everybody's dates that are so long ago get a little bit closer, more closer to human history. And so now we know that the last Neanderthals that we have found and, you know, like remains for were in Gibraltar, down at the like Straits of Gibraltar, kind of probably driven there. That's kind of an extremity of the continent. And it was in, I want to say it was like 8 or 7,000 BC. It was much more recent than people were pegging the last Neanderthals at. And then now that we've done all these DNA tests all around the world, we know that many people, not African, not most African people, but most Europeans and some Asian people share a percentage of Neanderthal in their DNA. I did Ancestry.com one, and I'm like 1.5 or 2% Neanderthal. Not everybody is. So there's all those kinds of things that you go, well, what is that? There's not really a cohesive narrative, of how all of those things fit together. So just as like maybe even an exercise of stretching your comfortability about what you think about humans and human origins, just kind of glancing over a non-narratorized fossil record. Like there's no commentary on this. Nobody's saying this is what happened or this what evolved from this, or it's you can just go look at like bones, where people found them, how complete skeletons were. It's fascinating, and it was I just found it interesting to do. It's one Wikipedia page. The other one is the one that John shared with the list of global flood narratives, because there's so many of them. That's a great one. There are 2 videos. They're both long. They're 2 hours each. I mean, you guys are sat through these, so you're probably not scared of those. But they're by Jordan Peterson. Are any of you guys familiar with Jordan Peterson?
Is that the Canadian psychologist?
Yes. Yeah, he teaches at Harvard, or used to teach at Harvard. He's a psychologist.
Yeah. I've heard him a couple times.
He's super interesting. He's very contrarian. He's, for fundamentalists, he'd be super liberal, but for liberals, they get pissed off at him all the time because he's kind of conservative. So, he'll attack like PC culture and some of those types of things. And then he's not a Christian, but he does a lot of kind of study and thinking and speaking on the Bible. And so he has a whole series on Genesis, and they're these like 2-hour long kind of thought pieces. And it's not on the science of the flood. It's on what it means. And man, his interpretations of,
because he's a psychologist, he would have that kind of background bringing to it, I imagine.
Yeah. And so like the conclusions that he arrives at about sin and repentance, I mean, they're like the best summaries I've ever heard. And he's not even a Christian. So it's worth watching. He has 2 on the flood. So one's on God and the flood myth or flood narrative. And the other one is on Noah, Abraham, and the flood, I think. They're really good. And then there's a just fascinating article a YouTube video by this quirky, I think he's a linguist, actually, maybe an anthropological linguist, for like Semitic languages like Ugaritic and stuff. And so he takes, I think it's the Epic of Gilgamesh, and builds a, what are the name? There's a name for this specific kind of boat, but he builds it. He gets funding and builds it. I think they wind up having to build it in India because the war in Iraq prevented them from actually building it in Iraq, which they wanted to do. And it looks like an ark. It's small. It's much smaller than kind of the version in, Kentucky that they built. But it's really fascinating. And he talks all about, he's an atheist. He's a straight up, no, maybe he's an agnostic. He's definitely not religious though, but to hear some of his own conclusions on it, I found very fascinating. And then I have like, there's two videos that I have seen. One I saw recently, just yesterday, I went looking for some videos, and then that's where I found out about the Black Sea or the Caspian Sea becoming salty. But then there was another one I saw maybe a year or two ago on unexplained geological phenomenon. It's not specifically about the flood, this one, but it has a bunch of stuff in it that I saw that I'm like, oh, well, that's interesting. And that might line up with a big flood, at that time or in that area or for that whole continent or whatever. So I will post those for you guys. I'm actually saving them on YouTube. So I've been posting. Oh, thank you for posting that, Lynn. I've been posting our Zoom meetings to YouTube, and maybe, two people in the universe have seen them. I don't have YouTube followers. I've been posting them more just for record, and so that if we want, we can go back and, reference something or share something or listen to something. But I'm also I think all of the things I referenced, besides the Wikipedia pages, are YouTube videos. So I already saved one of the Jordan Peterson videos to the Scriptura playlist I have under my YouTube channel, The Darkest Timeline, where the Scriptura videos are placed. So I'll post those there. And peruse them if you want. There's no, I don't feel like there's any revelation probably in many of those that would be, life-changing. The Jordan Peterson videos are...
He's really insightful, I find.
He is.
And very thoughtful. And when even if you don't agree with him, he makes points. You have to recognize that. Yeah.
And he's Canadian, so even if you don't agree with him, you're like, oh, you're nice.
I like Jordan Peterson. Myself, I enjoy. He has a variety of topics from love to relationships to even motivational things, and I've listened to him. He's good.
Yeah, good. I'm glad you like him. Yeah, I really appreciate him. I appreciate people that are just different thinkers, and he's definitely different and isn't afraid to kind of go against the grain or against the system. So his kind of thoughts on floods and the Noah story, and I just thought was like, oh, this is great. And if I had listened to that lecture of his though 25 years ago, I don't know that I could have heard much of it beyond my kind of nerves or reaction to it, because I felt like I needed to defend a certain kind of interpretation of Genesis that wasn't necessarily my own interpretation. And rightfully so. I mean, I was a pretty young kid and a younger Christian, so my own interpretation of Genesis I don't know that I could have interpreted much of it. That's kind of how it is when we're younger, right? So it's not that we, the same way we're not held to standards of ignorance beyond our own time, right? Because people in the future are going to look back on our generation and be like, oh, those morons. I can't believe there's a big truck. Sorry.
Have a Coke.
The Coca-Cola distribution place is right around the corner. So they pull through here now because they also set up a drive-through COVID testing thing across the street that blocks off L14 there. So the Coke trucks drive through here at night. What I was trying to say was the same way historically we're not held to standards of knowledge that we don't have access to. We're conversely also held to account for the knowledge that we can have access to and easily can have access to, but choose to ignore. I also think interpersonally there are different levels of that knowledge and that series of revelations. So I think that some of that's what Paul meant when he's like, hey, when I was a baby, I talked like a baby. When I'm a man, I put the baby things behind me. It's like, well, yeah, when you're a little kid, you're told some of these stories like Noah's Ark in really concrete terms because, well, you're a kid. You think concretely. Everything's black and white. You couldn't go into like all this super elaborate detail with a 6-year-old asking a question about Noah's Ark. But when you're an adult, you can put those things behind you and think about them at like a more abstract level because we have more abstract thinking power, like our brains developed it, our frontal lobe is developed. Paul didn't know anything about frontal lobes when he said that. He just knew that's how humans are. That's human nature. And so when we take on a thing that somebody teaches us, or maybe we grow up in a denomination or a church or a tradition and learn interpretations. Yeah, that's not wrong to do. But at some point we shouldn't go out running to demolish those interpretations either, right? It's that when we come across questions to those interpretations that we don't feel like we can go out and look for answers, but we feel like we have to defend, that's where we're in trouble. Whether it's biblical stuff or not, actually. It's kind of regardless at that point. Politically, right? If you run into a point where you just keep saying the same thing and you're like, I'm repeating this phrase, but I don't actually believe it as much as I used to because I've got these questions about things. That's when we pause and then just go, okay, well, we live by grace, so we're free to go ask questions and not have all the answers for it yet. So like, I don't know concretely how the flood worked or exactly what that looked like. But I feel okay not knowing that. And I feel much more free, I think, than a pastor would have felt to feel like that 50 years ago. Mm-hmm. Like there's a lot of pressure to have the right answer and to know those things. But the more we know, the more we genuinely know that we don't know, because good God, just go spend time on Wikipedia. You can't know. There's just too many things to know. So now there's even more of a freedom for humans to say, we don't know that maybe quite as well as we thought we did. And I think that theologians should apply that to scripture and biblical history just as much as anthropologists and biologists should apply that to theories of evolution, and astronomers should apply that to like star history and all of those different things that we say very rigidly and concretely. We know, we figured it out, but hey, look back at all the different times we've ever had human history. Every time humans are like, we know, we figured it out. We've got it. Well, there's always another generation that figures more stuff out that we're like, we didn't know that actually. We got that wrong. You shouldn't cut people's temples on the sides of their heads to alleviate headaches. It doesn't work very well. So, oh, man. Craziness. I don't know. Any closing thoughts from you guys on that?
Fruitful discussion as always.
I see some chat in here. I didn't get to I'm just on my phone, so let's see.
I found it kind of interesting too that like some of the references in the Epic of Gilgamesh to like they talked about a Book of the Dead, and just the concepts they had, and aging that far back.
Yeah. I'm just reading through the chat. Interesting. Yeah, the release of birds. Vampire. Yeah, I don't remember that actually.
The Epic of Gilgamesh, even though it's one of the oldest literature pieces we have, it's like it changes because Assyrianologists and archaeologists are constantly going through the archives that they dug up and that they have, and they're still uncovering them. And so some of the blank spots that they filled in, they're able to fill in. And so that they're able to, like, it, not that there's anything major, it's pretty obvious what some of those words were in between, but every now and again they'll find that word is actually this, and so they'll have to change it just to hear.
Nice. I didn't know that. That's good to know. That's good. And you know, the crazy thing is, like, before 150 years ago, humans had totally forgotten that happened. We didn't have the Epic of Gilgamesh. It was lost. Nobody knew it, and they couldn't read it. Like, it was just gone, right? It's like, oh, geez. Like, okay, well, when the flood narrative is written, people are not even remembering that because that would have been in a different part of the world when it's written. And then, you know, history goes on, and this flood narrative gets remembered and recorded, but that flood one gets forgotten. And, you know, those people disappear, right? And there are no more Babylonians. It's just interesting.
It's you know, we read it as mythology, and I'm wondering if it was intended to be literature or history when, you know, to the ancient peoples.
Yeah. Well, and you know, like
those
go
were one
on.
and the same to them.
Yeah.
So for us, because in our minds, we have very strong we distinguish between fiction and nonfiction. Whereas for them, if you're telling a good story that was about your grandpa, it might be 100% accurate, but if you make it a really lame story, then, you know, why would you bother making a history out of that? So whatever story happens, whether it's in our minds 100% accurate or not, they're going to make it sound epic.
So then on that note, him being 2/3 God, 1/3 man, and then it might be apropos to the Nephilim conversation we might have.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm trying to remember the name of the guy he was actually out here last year or the year before. Anthony Delgado at Sunrise had him out here. I can't remember his name though. He does some interesting stuff with like the Nephilim and the and demons and kind of demonology. He's got very interesting interpretations of it. Michael something. Do you guys know what I'm talking about? Right? I'll email Anthony because I want to look up like some podcasts or something by him for next week, because the stuff I heard from him, I only heard a little bit, was very interesting. It was good, because that's you know, when you get to the Nephilim, it's like everybody's got opinions on the Bible, and then you get there and everybody has an opinion, but nobody's actually quite as concrete on that opinion. We are about other things, right? We get to that and everybody's got a thought, but it's like, well, hold that one loosely.
Say hi to Anthony from Josh if you talk to him.
I totally will. It'd be cool. I'll just ask him to come on here next week. Actually, that'd be cool to have him join us. That'd make the conversation great, because yeah, this is a topic that every youth kid would ask about anytime I do open question night at youth group. Every time it was something about the Nephilim.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, yeah, fare thee well, guys. See you next week.
Bye, guys. Have a good night.
All right.
Ciao.
Peace out.